There is a city built inside a mountain, not beside a mountain, not on top of one. Inside one, carved directly into rose-red sandstone cliffs that rise 300 feet straight out of the desert floor in what is now southern Jordan. The Nabateans would later make it famous. But long before them, another people lived there, a people who looked at those cliffs and thought, nothing can reach us here, nothing can touch us. We are beyond the range of consequence. Their name was Edom, and roughly 26 centuries ago, on a day that the Bible records with unusual specificity, those Edomites climbed to the top of their cliffs and watched the city of Jerusalem burn. They did not put out the fire. They did not go down to help. Some of them, according to the historian Josephus, did something far worse. They blocked the roads. They turned back the refugees. They pointed at the fleeing families and said, "Not this way." And they watched. There is a moment, and nobody knows exactly when it happens, when a door closes, not with a slam, with a click, quiet, almost polite. And by the time you hear it, you are already on the wrong side, and the handle no longer turns from where you're standing. The Edomites heard that click. They just didn't know it yet. This video is about that click. Stay with me, because I need to tell you something before we go any further. This is not a story about an ancient nation that no longer exists. This is not a story about a war that ended 3,000 years ago. This is not a story about Edom. This is a story about you, about the specific, quiet, almost invisible process by which a human heart, your heart, my heart, can move from sensitivity to stone. Not all at once. Nobody goes to stone all at once. It happens in 4 stages, each one smaller than the last, each one easier to justify, each one closing the door a fraction more until one day you reach for the handle and realize, with a cold and terrible clarity, that something has changed. The book of Obadiah is 21 verses long. It is the shortest book in the entire Old Testament. Most people skip it entirely, a strange little prophecy tucked between Amos and Jonah, easy to miss, easy to forget. Scholars debate when it was written. Some say 845 BC, which would make Obadiah possibly the earliest of all the writing prophets. Others say 686. Others say 585, right after Jerusalem fell. What everyone agrees on is this: Obadiah arrived with a message. He delivered it, and he left. No genealogy, no backstory. His name means servant of the Lord, and that is all we get. A servant with a word so sharp, so specific, so surgically precise about how hearts go wrong, that 26 centuries later it reads less like ancient history and more like a diagnosis. 4 stages: pride, distance, gloating, betrayal. Each one a door closing, each one quieter than the one before. And the reason I need you to pay very close attention to what comes next is this. By the time most people recognize the pattern, they are already in stage 3. And stage 3, as we will see, is the stage where the awareness starts to go, where the warning lights stop feeling like warning lights and start feeling like background noise. But we are not starting in stage 3. We are starting at the beginning, in a field, with 2 brothers and a bowl of red stew. His name was Esau. He was born first, by seconds, technically, because his twin brother came out immediately after him, grabbing his heel, which is how the second boy got his name. Jacob means heel grabber. In Hebrew, it also means the one who supplants, the one who takes what isn't his. Even at birth, the 2 brothers were already in a story that was bigger than either of them understood. Esau was the one people noticed first. He was red-skinned, covered in hair, broad and physical, and loud, in the way that firstborn sons in the ancient Near East were supposed to be. He was a hunter. He came home smelling of the field. His father Isaac loved him for it, loved the wild smell of him, loved the meat he brought back, loved the version of masculinity that Esau embodied without trying. And one afternoon, Esau came home from the field, and he was hungry. His brother Jacob was at the fire, cooking a pot of red stew. The smell of it hit Esau before he even reached the tent, and something in him, something animal, something immediate, something that had no patience for anything beyond the next 5 minutes, said, "I need that now." Jacob looked up. He already had the price in mind. "Sell me your birthright," Jacob said. The birthright was everything. In the ancient world, the firstborn son received a double portion of the inheritance, the blessing of the father, the spiritual headship of the family line. For Esau, it meant the covenant that God had made with his grandfather Abraham, the land, the nation, the lineage that would one day change the world. It was not a small thing, it was the largest thing. It was the thing that, if you were paying attention to the story you were living inside, you would protect with your life. Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me?" He was not about to die, he was hungry. That is the distinction Obadiah wants you to feel in your chest. The hunger was real. The stew was real. The exhaustion was real. Nobody is saying Esau was lying about the state of his body. But the decision he made in that moment, the decision to treat the permanent as if it were negotiable, to trade the eternal for the immediate, to look at something that could never be replaced and say, "I don't need that right now." That decision had a name. The Hebrew word is gaon. It appears in the 3rd verse of Obadiah, and it is usually translated as pride. But gaon is not ordinary pride. Gaon is not the feeling you get when your child takes their first steps or your team wins a championship. Gaon is something more specific and more dangerous than that. Gaon is the pride that rewrites reality, the pride that looks at the landscape of your life and quietly, without announcement, without ceremony, stops asking God what he thinks about it. Gaon is the pride that says, "I have this handled." Obadiah writes, "The pride of your heart has deceived you, not corrupted you, not destroyed you, deceived you." The first thing pride does is not make you wicked. The first thing pride does is make you wrong about your own situation, convinced you are higher, safer, more secure, more beyond consequence than you actually are. The Edomites had built their city in cliffs 300 feet above the desert floor. They looked out at their neighbors, the Israelites, the Moabites, the Philistines, and what they felt was not gratitude. What they felt was a quiet, rock-solid certainty that they were untouchable. Obadiah chapter 1 verse 4. "Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." That is not poetry. That is a geological fact stated in advance. Here's what most people miss about pride in its first stage. It does not feel like pride. It feels like clarity. It feels like you have finally figured something out that other people haven't figured out yet. It feels like the confidence of someone who has done the math and found that the numbers work in their favor. The Edomites did not wake up one morning and decide to be arrogant. They just stopped being afraid of God, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way a room cools down after the fire goes out. Not all at once, but so slowly that you only notice when you can see your breath. Esau sold his birthright. He ate the stew, got up from the bowl and walked away. And the Bible records, in one of the most devastating lines in the entire Old Testament, that Esau, having traded away the most significant thing he possessed for a single meal, despised his birthright, not regretted it, despised it. He made peace with the trade before he even stood up, and that peace, that settled, untroubled ease with a catastrophic exchange, that is what Gaon looks like from the inside. It doesn't feel like a fall. It feels like a decision you are comfortable with. It feels like you got what you needed, and what you gave up probably wasn't as important as people made it sound. That is stage one. And here is the terrifying thing about stage one. Almost no one recognizes it in themselves while it is happening. You don't wake up and think, "I am becoming proud." You wake up and think, "I am becoming clearer." You don't notice that you have stopped praying with urgency. You notice that you feel less anxious than you used to. You don't observe that God's word has stopped landing with weight. You observe that you feel more settled, more stable, more sure of your own footing. It feels like growth. It is the first door, and the handle turns easily from this side. You can still go back. You can still feel the weight of what you are letting go. Esau could have said no. The Edomites could have rebuilt differently. Lower, less fortified, less insulated from the kind of vulnerability that keeps a person honest before God. But they didn't, and neither did their descendants. 500 years later, the second door opened. 500 years is a long time to carry a grudge. But that is exactly what the Edomites did. From the moment Jacob tricked Esau out of their father's blessing, the blessing that should have been Esau's by birth, the blessing Isaac spoke over the wrong son while his eyes were too dim to see. From that moment, the book of Genesis tells us Esau held a grudge. The Hebrew is not subtle about it. It says Esau harbored hatred for his brother. The prophet Ezekiel, writing centuries later, would call it an ancient hostility, a bitterness so old it had become structural, load-bearing, woven into the identity of an entire people. 500 years. Think about what that means. Think about a hatred so carefully tended, so regularly fed, so thoroughly passed from parent to child to grandchild, that by the time Jerusalem is burning in 586 BC, the Edomites, watching from their cliffs, have never personally met a single Israelite who wronged them. They are carrying a wound they did not receive. They are nursing a grievance that was already ancient when their great-great-grandparents were children. And when Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army finally does what the Edomites have been fantasizing about for generations, when the walls of Jerusalem crack and the temple catches fire, and the people of God scatter into the streets like broken pottery, the Edomites do something that will be remembered in Scripture for the next 600 years. They stand aloof. That is Obadiah's word. Verse 11, on the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. The Hebrew behind stood aloof is shan. It means to be at ease, to be undisturbed, to stand at a comfortable distance from something that should be disturbing you, and feel nothing, or worse, to feel something and choose the distance anyway. This is stage 2. And I need you to understand something about stage 2, because it is the most subtle of the 4 stages and in many ways the most destructive, because stage 2 does not feel like sin. Stage 2 feels like wisdom. Stage 2 feels like maturity. It feels like I am not going to get involved in something that is not my problem. The Edomites did not draw a sword against Jerusalem. They did not light a torch. They stood on their cliffs, in their carved rock city, in their Gaon, their settled, untouchable pride. And they watched, and God looked at them and said, you were like one of them, not similar to them, not almost like them, like one of them. The watcher and the destroyer, God puts them in the same sentence. The person who stands at a comfortable distance while someone is being destroyed and feels nothing, God does not call that person neutral. God calls that person complicit. But it gets stranger, because Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, does not let the Edomites off even at the level of passive watching. He records that during the Babylonian siege, the Edomites did not merely stand aside. They blocked the roads. They turned back Jewish families who were trying to flee. They stood at the crossroads, not with Babylonian swords technically, but with Edomite bodies. And they made sure that the people running from the fire had nowhere to run to. Psalm 137 is a poem written by one of the survivors, one of the people who made it out. And in the middle of that haunting psalm, the one that begins with weeping beside the rivers of Babylon, the one that asks, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? There is a verse that most people skip over because it is uncomfortable. Verse 7, remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. tear it down to its foundations. That is not a neutral observer. That is a crowd on a cliff, watching a city burn, shouting encouragement at the fire. And yet, and this is the part I need you to sit with, every single Edomite standing on that cliff could have told you, if you asked them, that they had not done anything wrong, they had not attacked anyone, they had not broken any treaty. They were just watching, just staying out of something that was not their business, just maintaining a safe and sensible distance from a conflict between Babylon and Israel. That technically had nothing to do with them. This is what stage 2 does to a person. It does not make you feel guilty. It makes you feel reasonable. And that is why it is so dangerous, because the person in stage 1, the proud person, the Gaian person, at least has the potential to be shaken. Show them the cliff is not as high as they think. Show them the safety is not as solid as they feel. There is still a chance the weight of reality lands on them and something breaks open. But the person in stage 2 has added a layer between themselves and that landing. They have put distance between themselves and anything that might require them to feel the weight. They have insulated themselves, not with walls, but with withdrawal, not with rejection, but with the simple, quiet, almost dignified act of not showing up. If you have ever watched someone you loved go through the worst season of their life, and you told yourself you didn't want to intrude, you didn't want to make it about you, you didn't want to say the wrong thing, and so you said nothing and did nothing and kept your comfortable distance while they burned, then you know what Shan feels like from the inside. It feels like giving them space. God calls it something else. Now, before we go any further, if this video is landing on you with any weight at all, I want to ask you to do one thing. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because what we are building here, across this channel, is exactly this kind of content. The kind that does not let you stay comfortable. The kind that takes the shortest, most ignored books of the Bible and pulls out of them a word so specific it feels personal. That is what we do here. And if you want more of it, subscribing takes 3 seconds and means you will not miss the next one. Now, back to Edom, because stage 2, the standing aloof, the sha'an, the comfortable distance, does not hold forever. There is something about watching your brother suffer from a safe distance that does something to you over time. Something that should have stayed painful starts to feel interesting. Something that should have produced guilt starts to produce something else entirely. Something that looks at a distance almost like satisfaction. That is stage 3. And stage 3 is where the face of this thing changes completely. There is a specific kind of pleasure that should not exist. You know the one. The pleasure that flickers. Just for a second. Just briefly enough that you can almost pretend it didn't happen. When someone who has been doing better than you starts doing worse. When the person who had the thing you wanted loses the thing you wanted. When the marriage you envied starts to crack. When the career you resented starts to stall. When the city you hated starts to burn. The Germans have a word for it, schadenfreude, joy at another's suffering. The Bible has a word for it too, and it is not a gentle word. Obadiah chapter 1 verse 12. And I want you to hear this carefully, because this verse is structured in a way that is almost clinical, almost like a physician listing symptoms in order of severity. God does not say to the Edomite, you did this terrible thing. He says, you should not have done this, and this, and this, and this. 4 lines, each one a step further down. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune. That is the first line. The gloating, the standing on the cliff and feeling in your chest a warmth that has no business being there. Not grief, not horror, not the instinct to run down and help. Something else, something quiet and shameful and deeply human. The relief of watching someone else fall. You should not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction. That is the second line. The gloating has become rejoicing. What was a flicker has become a feeling you are leaning into. What was passive has become active. You are not just failing to grieve, you are choosing to celebrate. You should not boast so much in the day of their trouble. Third line. The private feeling has gone public. You are talking about it now. You are telling your neighbors, your children, the people standing next to you on the cliff. You are making it a story in which you are not the villain, in which Babylon is just a force of nature, in which Israel's collapse is simply what happens when a nation loses God's favor. And you are telling that story with something that sounds, from the outside, like analysis. But from the inside, can see from the inside, it sounds like boasting. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster. Fourth line. And this is where the passive becomes active. This is where the watching becomes walking. The Edomites have moved from the cliff to the city. They are inside the gates now, not to help, not to rescue, not to pull anyone out of the rubble. They are there to see, to take, to be present at a destruction that delights them. And this is where it gets remarkable. Because the Hebrew word underneath all four of these lines, the word that colors the whole texture of what Obadiah is describing, is chamas, violence, not the violence of a sword necessarily, the violence of a disposition, the violence of a heart that has learned to be energized by destruction rather than grieved by it. Chamas is the same word used in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11, to describe the state of the earth before God sent the flood. The earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of chamas. When Noah's generation reached the point where human beings had so completely lost the image of God in themselves that violence had become normalized, that is chamas. And Obadiah looks at the Edomites on the cliff, watching Jerusalem burn, and uses that word. This is not just bad behavior. This is a diagnostic term. This is Obadiah saying, I have seen this before. I know what this is. This is what a heart looks like when it has traveled from stage 1 to stage 2 and arrived, quietly and without fanfare, at stage 3, and the arrival feels completely natural. Pay attention to this, because stage 3 is not what most people think it is. Most people imagine that if they were gloating, really gloating, the way the Edomites were gloating, they would know it. They would recognize the ugliness in themselves and feel ashamed of it. They would catch the schadenfreude flicker and name it for what it is. But here is what Obadiah understands about stage 3 that we tend to miss. By the time you reach stage 3, you have already spent an extended period in stage 2. You have already practiced distance. You have already trained yourself not to feel what you should feel when people around you suffer. You've already built, brick by quiet brick, a wall between your heart and the weight of other people's pain, and a heart that has stopped feeling pain. Someone else's pain, the pain it should carry as a brother, as a neighbor, as a member of the human family. A heart that has made that journey does not suddenly start feeling guilt when the suffering of others begins to feel good. It feels like justice. That is the word the Edomites would have used. Not gloating, justice. 500 years of being the second brother. 500 years of watching Jacob's descendants live in the land of promise while Edom scraped a living out of the desert rocks. 500 years of the covenant going to someone else. The blessing going to someone else. The favor going to someone else. And now Jerusalem is burning, and it feels, God help them, it feels, like the scales are finally balancing. This is not a story about a cruel people who enjoyed cruelty. This is not a story about a nation that was born evil. This is not a story about Edom being some uniquely monstrous civilization that the rest of us can safely look at from a distance and feel superior to. This is a story about what happens to any human heart, your heart, my heart, that starts with pride, retreats into distance, and then one day discovers, to its own quiet horror, that it has stopped mourning what God mourns and started celebrating what God weeps over. And stage 3 is survivable. Barely, but survivable. There is still a warning light on, dim but on. Obadiah is speaking. The word is going out. The fourfold, you should not, is still a should not a you have done what cannot be undone. There is still a door. It is nearly closed, but nearly is not fully. Stage 4 is full. Stage 4 is where the door does not just close. Stage 4 is where a person walks through it, pulls it shut behind them, and keeps walking. And the last step, the final step, is the one nobody ever plans to take. There is a man you need to meet. He does not appear in the book of Obadiah by name, but he is Obadiah's final word made flesh. He is what stage 4 looks like when it walks around in human skin, sits on a throne, makes decisions, and looks into the faces of children without flinching. His name was Herod, Herod the Great, king of Judea, appointed by Rome, builder of the second temple, the same temple Jesus would one day walk through, the same temple the disciples would point to with admiration, the same temple Jesus would say would be torn down stone by stone. Herod built it, Herod expanded it, and Herod was, by blood and by lineage and by the unbroken thread of 5 centuries of hardening, a descendant of Edom. The historians call his people Edomians. That is the Greek rendering of the word, but the root is identical. Idumea, Edom, the red rock people, the cliff people, the people who watched Jerusalem burn and shouted encouragement at the fire. Herod was the last chapter of that story, and the chapter begins with wise men. Matthew chapter 2 tells us that magi, scholars, astronomers, men who had been watching the sky for signs, arrived Jerusalem asking a question that would unravel Herod's world. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. The text says Herod was disturbed. That is Matthew's careful diplomatic word. The Greek behind it is etarakta. He was shaken, agitated. The internal weather of a man who has built his entire identity on being the king, being the one, being the indispensable and irreplaceable center of power, and who has just been told, by foreign scholars who have no reason to lie, that someone else has already been born to replace him. He calls the chief priests, he calls the teachers of the law. He asks them where the Messiah is supposed to be born. They tell him, Bethlehem. He calls the Magi privately. He asks them exactly when the star appeared. He does the math. And then he sends them to Bethlehem with a request so smooth, so reasonable, so draped in the language of devotion that it would almost be convincing if you didn't know what was underneath it. Go and search carefully for the child, Herod says. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. He does not want to worship him. The Magi find the child. They give their gifts. They have a dream warning them not to return to Herod, and so they go home a different way. And Herod waits. He waits for the sound of footsteps that do not come. He waits for the report that does not arrive. And at some point, the text does not tell us exactly when, does not give us the precise hour, does not describe the expression on his face. Herod realizes that the Magi are not coming back. This is the moment I want you to feel, because this is the moment where a person with any remaining softness, any residual tenderness, any last thread of the image of God still visible in the fabric of who they are, this is the moment where that person might pause, might feel something, might hear very faintly the sound of a door. Herod does not pause. He sends soldiers to Bethlehem with orders to kill every male child 2 years old and under. No hesitation, no visible internal conflict, no recorded moment of doubt. The text moves from the Magi's departure to Herod's order with the terrifying efficiency of a man who has been making this kind of calculation for so long that it no longer requires effort. The machinery of his heart is so well oiled in the direction of self-preservation at any cost that the murder of children registers as a logistical problem, not a moral one. This is stage 4. This is what Obadiah chapter 1 verse 14 describes when it says, "You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. The Edomites at the crossroads, Herod in the palace. The geography is different. The century is different. The mechanism is identical. Stage 1 said, I am beyond consequence. Stage 2 said, I will not involve myself. Stage 3 said, I am glad this is happening. Stage 4 says, I will make sure it finishes. And here is the thing about Stage 4 that Obadiah and Matthew and Hebrews chapter 12 all agree on. By the time a person reaches Stage 4, they are not experiencing it as a fall. They are experiencing it as clarity, as necessary action, as the logical conclusion of a series of completely reasonable steps, each of which felt justified at the time, none of which felt like a point of no return, all of which were. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 17. The writer is talking about Esau, the original man, the first bowl of red stew, the birthright traded for a meal. And he says this, afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not bring about any change of mind. He sought it with tears. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because this is not the picture of a man who doesn't care. This is the picture of a man who cares enormously, who wants desperately what he gave away, who is weeping, actually weeping, in the presence of his Father, and the door does not open, not because God is cruel, not because the tears weren't real, but because the process of hardening had run its full course, and the man who was doing the weeping was no longer capable of the repentance the moment required. He could feel the loss. He could not feel the turn. The door had clicked. I want to tell you something about that click, about how it actually happens in a human life. And I want to use an image that has nothing to do with ancient Edom, but everything to do with the way this process works in the body as well as the soul. There is a moment in a doctor's office that most of us have either experienced or dreaded. Not the moment of diagnosis, the moment just before it, when the doctor asks, how long have you been feeling this? And the honest answer is 6 months, 8 months, a year. And you know, sitting in that chair under those lights, that you knew. Somewhere underneath the busyness, underneath the willingness to explain it away, underneath the very human preference for not knowing what you don't want to know, you knew something was wrong. The hardening didn't begin in that office. It began the morning you felt the first symptom and made the quiet, comfortable, entirely reasonable decision not to ask. That is Stage 1. The pride that says I am probably fine. That is Stage 2. The distance that says I will not look at this directly. That is Stage 3. The gloating, the relief. This is probably nothing. That is Stage 4. The day you stop going to the doctor altogether because you have decided, in the wordless calculus of a hardened heart, that you would rather not know than know and have to change. And Edom chose not to know. 500 years of not knowing. 500 years of the ancient hostility feeling like justice, the distance feeling like wisdom, the gloating feeling like balance finally restored, the betrayal feeling like Babylon's problem that they just happened to be adjacent to. And Obadiah chapter 1 verse 18, there will be no survivors from the house of Esau. Eusebius, the 4th century historian, writing in his Onomasticon, notes that by his time, 300 years after Christ, the Edomite people had entirely ceased to exist as a distinct nation, not scattered, not diminished, gone. Obadiah said it would happen. It happened. The city carved in rock, built for permanence, designed to outlast everything, gone. And Herod's line ended violently. His sons turned on each other. His dynasty dissolved. The last of the Herodian family disappears from history within a generation of Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD. The very destruction that Josephus records was assisted again by Edomian forces who entered the city and massacred its inhabitants. The pattern completed itself. But here is the part nobody tells you, and I need you to hear this before we go to the takeaways, because this is the part that changes everything. Obadiah does not end with Edom. After 20 verses of the most precise, most clinical, most unflinching diagnosis of a hardened nation that the Bible contains, after the verdict, after the sentence, after the historical record that confirmed every word, Obadiah pivots one verse, verse 17. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance, the burned city, the broken walls, the people dragged away in chains, mocked by their brothers, abandoned at the crossroads. That city, that people, deliverance. Not Edom, not the cliff city, not the fortress carved 300 feet into the rock, the city that fell, the city that burned, the city that looked to every reasonable observer in 586 BC. Like the end of the story, that is where Obadiah says deliverance will come from, and that is the answer to the door that clicks shut on a hardened heart. Obadiah is not writing to Edom in the hope that they will change. By verse 3, the diagnosis is already complete. He is writing from inside the wreckage to remind the broken city that the door is not what closes the story. The door closes on the heart that chose to close it. But for the city that is still weeping, for the exile by the rivers of Babylon who still feels the weight of what has been lost, for the person watching this video who recognizes themselves somewhere in those four stages and feels, in their chest, the specific cold fear of someone who is not sure how far down the road they have already traveled. The door is still open. It is still open because you can still feel it. The terrifying mercy of God is this: a fully hardened heart does not fear hardening. A fully hardened heart does not watch a 25-minute video about the book of Obadiah and feel anything. The fact that something in you is responding right now, the fact that stage 2 or stage 3 or stage 4 landed somewhere specific, somewhere personal, somewhere that has a name you haven't said out loud yet, that response is the open door. That is what Hebrews 3, verse 13 means when it says, "Encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness." Today, not eventually, not when you feel ready. Today, while the weight is still landing. Today, while the door is still on its hinges. Today, before the click. So let's come back to Petra. Let's go back to the rose-red cliffs, the carved city, the fortress that looked at the rest of the world from 300 feet up and felt in its stone bones that it was permanent, that it was safe, that it had found the right combination of height and rock and distance to be beyond on the reach of anything that might require it to be humble or present or soft. It is gone now. You can visit the ruins. Tourists walk through the canyon every year, through the narrow passage the Nabateans called the Sick, the crack in the rock, and they come out on the other side and they see the treasury, the carved facade, the columns still standing after 2,000 years, and they take photographs and they feel the appropriate awe at something ancient and beautiful and empty. Empty. That is the word that lands eventually on every structure built for the purpose of being beyond consequence, not destroyed necessarily, sometimes just empty. The life drained out quietly, the way a heart drains when it chooses, at each small crossroads, the path that requires less of it. And 50 miles away, in a city that was burned to the ground, that was mocked by its brothers, and abandoned at the crossroads, and wept over by rivers in Babylon, a city that had every human reason to be the one that disappeared, the story did not end. It never ended. Jerusalem is still there, still standing, still the place where, 26 centuries after Obadiah wrote his 21 verses, people still gather and still pray and still feel the weight of a covenant that survived everything Edom threw at it, including Edom's silence, Edom's distance, Edom's gloating, and Edom's final fatal betrayal. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. Obadiah said it. It happened. It is still happening. And now, 3 takeaways. 3 things I want you to carry out of this video and into the rest of your day, your week, your life. The first is a truth. A heart does not harden all at once. It hardens in 4 stages. pride, distance, gloating, betrayal, and each stage feels smaller than it is, more justifiable than it is, more reversible than it is. The Edomites did not decide at some identifiable moment to become the people who shouted at a burning city. They became that people the way anyone becomes anything, gradually, then suddenly, through 1,000 small choices that each felt like nothing and together felt like everything. That is the truth Obadiah is carrying. That is why this 21-verse book is in the Bible, not as a historical curiosity, as a warning that is alive and specific and addressed with uncomfortable precision to you. The second is personal. The most dangerous stage is not stage 4. The most dangerous stage is stage 2. The distance, the shun, the comfortable withdrawal that wears the costume of innocence. Because stage 4 is recognizable. Stage 4 has a face. Stage 4 is Herod sending soldiers. Nobody watching stage 4 from the outside mistakes it for something neutral. But stage 2, standing aloof, not getting involved, keeping a safe and sensible distance from the suffering that requires something of you. Stage 2 can run for years, decades, an entire lifetime, and be mistaken by everyone around you and by you yourself for wisdom, for maturity, for healthy boundaries. God does not call it healthy boundaries. God says, you were like one of them. Look at your life right now. Not at the dramatic moments, at the quiet ones. The friend you have been meaning to call, the conversation you have been meaning to have, the weight you felt once about someone else's pain, and the fact that you do not feel it quite as sharply anymore, and the fact that that change feels somehow like progress. Ask yourself, Sean? Because the difference between a wise pause and a hardening withdrawal is not visible from the outside. It is only visible from the inside, in the specific quality of what you feel or what you have stopped feeling when you think about the person on the other side of your distance. And the third takeaway is the one I need you to sit with. The door does not slam, it clicks, and the terrifying mercy of God, the mercy that is running underneath every single verse of this short, sharp, devastating little book, is that a heart which is still capable of being warned is a heart that has not yet clicked shut. The warning is the mercy. The discomfort you feel right now, if you feel it, is not condemnation. It is an open door. It is God, through a servant named Obadiah, who showed up with 21 verses and no backstory, and a word sharp enough to cut through 26 centuries of distance. It is God saying, not yet, not yet. The handle still turns from where you are standing. Turn it, not tomorrow. Not when the feeling fades and you can approach it more calmly and more comfortably. Now, while the weight is on you, while the name that surfaced somewhere in the last 25 minutes, the person, the relationship, the conversation, the withdrawal that started as wisdom and has been running long enough that you are not sure anymore. While that name is still in the room with you, turn it now. Before we go, I have one question for you, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Which of the 4 stages felt most familiar to you, or to someone you love? Pride, distance, gloating, or betrayal? Tell me honestly in the comments. Not because it is easy to say, but because naming it out loud is itself a form of turning the handle. And I read every comment on this channel, every single one. If this video gave you something, if Obadiah of all books landed somewhere specific in you today, share it with one person. Not because this channel needs the numbers. Because you already know someone who needs to hear this. You thought of them sometime in the last 25 minutes. You know who it is. And if you want to stay in this kind of content, the kind that takes the forgotten corners of Scripture and pulls out of them something alive and urgent and addressed directly to the life you are actually living, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We are building something here, and the next video is already waiting for you. Obadiah delivered his word. He left. The city he was writing about was still in ruins. The exile was still ongoing. The cliffs of Edom were still red and tall and seemingly permanent in the desert sun. But the word had gone out, and words, when they come from the right place, when they are carried by a servant who shows up without a backstory, delivers the message, and trusts the word to do what words from that place do, those words do not return empty. They find the door. They find the moment when a heart, however far along the road it has traveled, however many stages it has passed through, however quietly the click has been approaching, they find that moment just before, and they knock.